Okay, good evening, everybody. Uh, Welcome to this discussion about profiteering in Virginia. My name is Sean Winetta. I'm a policy strategist with the ACLU. We have some wonderful guests here tonight, but we also want to invite you into the conversation as well. So what we're going to be doing, we're going to be asking you to accept an invite as a panelist. So if you'd please go ahead and do that when you come into the room, when it comes onto your screen, please come in. We want to have you as part of the discussion. This is going to be something that impacts us. It impacts our loved ones. It impacts the Commonwealth statewide. So we want you to be part of that conversation. If you'd rather sit in the background, that's fine as well. Just listen. We have some really valuable information to tell you about tonight. And there's hearings, also all sorts of good stuff going on. Like I said, we do have some wonderful panelists tonight. I see some people joining the panel right now. We're going to go ahead and introduce ourselves. I'll tell you a little bit about ourselves, and hopefully everybody will be in the room at that point, and we can really start the discussion then. Again, my name is Sean Winetta. I'm a policy strategist with the ACLU. I was formerly with the Humanization Project, which is where some of you might be familiar with me from, and it was there that I started to get familiar with and work on this issue of jail and prison profiteering, and that is where I met my friend Chuck. And I'm going to ask Chuck to go ahead and introduce himself and tell us a little bit about himself.
Sure, thanks, Sean. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Chuck Mayer. I am a sort of Virginia-based prison reform advocate. I work primarily with a group called SALT, Social Action Linking Together, which is based in Northern Virginia. And I've been working with my friend Sean on this project for about a year now. We've put in a couple of bills last year to try and address this, which led to some studies that we're going to be telling you about shortly. And frankly, we're just excited to start building community input, starting to hear about what is important to you and how we can best serve your needs to help work on these studies and hopefully try and solve some of these profiteering issues in the next year. Turn it over to you, Sean.
All right, thank you, Chuck. And that led us to meet one of the smartest and toughest people I know, and that is Bianca Tylick with Worth Rises. And I will let her introduce herself.
Oh, that's so sweet, Sean. Hi, everyone. My name is Bianca Tylick. I use she, her pronouns. I am actually based out of New York, so I'm definitely the one coming from out of state, but I'm super excited to be here with you all in Virginia. I run an organization. I'm the executive director at Worth Rises. We are a national criminal justice organization working to dismantle the prison industry and end the exploitation of people who are incarcerated and their loved ones. And we have been at the forefront of the movement across the country to make prison and jail communication free. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Sean, back to you.
All right, and my good friend from Sisters in Prison Reform that we work together on a lot of stuff, Paulettra James.
Good afternoon or evening, everyone. My name is Paulettra James, and I am 1/3 of Sisters in Prison Reform. We primarily have been working on second look legislation, but because our loved ones are also affected by the astronomical costs that it takes to keep in touch with your loved ones, I am here speaking as well to share my story of being one of the affected individuals. And back to you, Sean.
Okay, and I just want to sit back and Paula and Bianca and Chuck really know this subject well, and I really love to hear them talk. So I would like to ask Bianca because she knows this subject better than anybody that I've ever seen, and I'd really love for her to tell us about what exactly jail and prison profiteering is, because it's something that you sort of see through social media, and you might have heard the term, but a lot of people think of private prisons when you hear jail and prison profiteering, but it's a lot more than that. And Bianca can tell us everything we're going to want to know. So Bianca, I'd love to hand it over to you and start the discussion.
Sure, thank you so much. So the first thing I'm going to say is that unfortunately I won't be able to tell you everything you need to know and should know about prison profiteering here, but I will recommend that if you are interested in learning more about the broader prison industry, that you visit worthrises.org/the curriculum. And there you can actually encounter an entire curriculum, including a textbook about the prison industry. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about profiteering that is more specific to how families and people who are incarcerated are exploited. It's important to realize that the prison industry is a $80 billion industry. That's not just, as Sean mentioned, private prisons. And for many in the room that are directly impacted, you know that you don't need to be in a private prison in order to know that or feel completely and utterly exploited, whether those are really problematic healthcare contracts with private companies that do not provide the healthcare that our friends and family need inside, or it's the food services contracts that serve low quality, barely edible food inside of our prisons and jails to our families and loved ones. That the industry is wider. Well, today I want to focus, as I mentioned, specifically on those costs that are actually carried and borne by people who are incarcerated and their families. And those are things like medical copays, money transfers, commissary, phone calls, right? And so let's start with that last one, the telecom industry, the prison telecom industry specifically. Prison telecom is a $1.4 billion industry all on its own. 90% of that industry is dominated by just 3 companies, 80% by just 2 companies. Those 2 are names that, for those who are experiencing this and impacted by this every day, probably household names and familiar: Securus and GTL. They split or you may hear it as Connect Network or JPay as well. Those are just brands under the same companies. They split that 80% in half, roughly 40-40. And then, to make matters worse, all 3 of those big companies that own 90% of this industry are actually owned by Wall Street private equity firms. And so we know who's really at the bottom of all this. And I'll tell you, for those who are paying Securus on a daily basis to their loved ones, there's actually the owner of Securus is actually the owner of the Detroit Pistons. And so you start to really unpack this pretty dramatically, and it's, I think, offensive as we know. These companies in the prison telecom industry, they charge families as much as $1 a minute to be on the phone. In 2020, that is incredibly exploitative, abusive, and predatory. We know that the cost of a call is frankly basically invisible, right? At $1 a minute, that means that is driving 1 in 3 families with a loved one who's incarcerated into debt. 87% of those carrying that burden are women, and disproportionately women of color. So this issue of, the costs behind incarceration becomes not just a criminal justice issue, but also an economic justice issue, a racial justice issue, a gender justice issue that we need to take a look at. And so with the phone calls, there's actually now things happening on the other side. And finally, successfully. For decades, families and advocates have been fighting to make communication in our prisons and jails affordable for families and for the loved ones inside. Well, in 2018, I'm really excited and proud to share that we passed the first bill in the nation to make phone calls out of a jail system entirely free. That was in New York City in 2018, as I mentioned, when we made phone calls free, and that was implemented in May of 2019. Families began to save roughly $10 million a year just in the city of New York, and call volume increased by almost 40% overnight, and that became the new normal. What we knew is not only was that millions that was being saved for families, but relationships and connections were being reignited that had been cut off due to the cost of calls. Since then, we've been able to do the same thing in San Francisco, San Diego, Los Angeles, Miami, Louisville, Kentucky, and just in 2021, we passed the first statewide bill to make communication entirely free out of a prison system, and that was in the state of Connecticut. We've also been able to encourage the federal system to go to completely free phone calls. At this point, the campaigns that have won have driven more than $100 million in savings annually for families that are often low income and struggling to communicate with their loved ones inside. And that's really exciting. And we're really, really excited to be helping Virginia get to that same place, to a place where communication in our prisons and jails are free. And why? Not just because it's ethically the right thing to do. We know that, right? That's the part that we can all coalesce around, is that the family unit is critical, that there is no child that should go to bed without hearing "I love you" simply because they cannot afford that call. No spouse, no mother should not know how her child is doing. A mother I know well who worked on our Connecticut campaign used to say, I knew that the first bill I paid every month was my phone bill with Securus. Why? I could let my lights go out because I can sit in the dark and talk to my son, but I need to know if my son's okay. And I know that that is a feeling that others have, and that we know we never want anyone to have again. But it's more than that ethical thing. When we're arguing in front of legislators and all of this, the arguments we make are multiple. And part of it is because it also mitigates trauma for children who are facing parental incarceration. We also know it increases hope and reduces desperation and violence inside of our facilities. We know it brings people home sooner. We know that it brings people home more successfully. People can come home and are more likely to have housing, to have employment, to have support systems if they are connected to their families during their incarceration. It reduces recidivism, it increases public safety. It is a communal good for us all. And so it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And we've been fighting that fight. I want to, just mention really quickly a few other things before passing it back. And I will answer the question that was in the chat, which I think also was a good question. I saw it come in. But, phone calls we know are not the only cost inside. Commissary is incredibly expensive and is increasingly more and more restrictive. We have worked on things like package restrictions, but actually in San Francisco, we were also able to reduce commissary prices by roughly 30–40% across the board. There are money transfers in New York City. We were able to renegotiate the fees associated with money transfers, where we know that they can be as high as 40% to send somebody a few dollars inside to spend on commissary. So, this fight is broad, and what we're excited about in Virginia, the bill and the legislation that we're going to talk about covers a lot of these bases. It's in fact the widest, broadest, I should say, piece of legislation addressing exploitation that's ever been passed or proposed in the US. And so really excited to see it continue to move forward and get, y'all's all input on that. So quickly, before I pass it back, just to answer the question that had been put up, because I do think it's a really critical point, is the question was, is there any law enforcement purposes that drive up the cost of phone calls, and what are the arguments of the current cost? Well, the first thing I'm going to share that many people may not know is that it's not just the predatory prison telecom companies that are actually making money off of this. It is the jails and the prisons too. This is a structure which they call a commission structure. In other words, it's basically a kickback. So imagine if there's a contract between the prison telecom vendor and say a jail, and the jail takes 50% of the revenue from that phone call. So not only is the prison telecom vendor making a tremendous amount, but they're essentially paying off the local jail to be able to have that contract. I always say that these contracts that telecom vendors have with jails is really more a profit sharing agreement than it is anything else. And so, addressing commissions is a major part, and commissions definitely do drive up rates considerably. So that's the first part to that. What are the other arguments? There are arguments, naturally, they try. And we'll tell you about some of the arguments that came up in Virginia in particular, because commissions were a big part of the equation this last session. including $38 million in commissions, to be specific. The argument was that they were being used on programs. And the reality was that out of 38 million, only $2 million collectively was spent in all the jails for programs. So what we really know is that this money is being used to operate our prisons and jails, which essentially makes it a regressive second tax on our, on families that have a loved one inside, despite a system that is meant to serve us all. The other argument that is often made, and I'll just address it here really quickly, is that there is security features on these calls that make calls expensive. So the first thing I'll say is that nothing about recording a phone call is actually expensive. I once said that to a room full of young people in tech, and I got laughed out of the room when they said, "That's expensive." That's not expensive. We do this every day, right? So the reality is that the functionality isn't actually expensive. And the second point there is that it's also not the responsibility of families, right? At the end of the day, there are walls, there are cameras, there are officers in those facilities, right, that are paid for by the taxpayers. When you come for a visit, you don't pay for the metal detector. There, are parameters around searching mail. You don't pay, an extra cost because you're sending a letter into a prison or jail. You shouldn't be responsible for the security features that any prison or jail chooses. In fact, we see security and surveillance expand simply because they're not the ones paying for it. We say, if you were cold, you'd buy one coat, but if somebody offers you 3, you'll take them all. And so that's sort of, part of what's driving up these costs. But it's basically everyone has their hand in the cookie jar except for our families. And with that, I'll pass it back to Sean and say it's time for us to change something.
Thank you so much, Bianca. And just to give a little idea of the impact that's having on one Virginia resident, we're going to open it up obviously to everybody else, but I want Paula to tell a little bit about her story, and then Chuck can talk a little bit about the numbers that Bianca touched on in Virginia and the legislation that we proposed this last session. So Paula, please tell us a little bit about your story and the burden that this has put on you over the last several years.
Sure. So, I have a son and a husband who is unfortunately incarcerated in Virginia's Department of Correction. And my son has been in since 2014. I met my husband while he was in, and we've been together since late 2016, but married since 2017. The amount of money that I have had to spend to provide for them as far as commissary, to get them, holiday packs, because the holiday packages offer items that they don't necessarily have access to from the commissary or within the facility, and phone calls and emails, roughly over $40,000 is how much I have spent. And I could have purchased my car twice with that amount of money. Thankfully, by God's grace, it didn't put me into debt, but I couldn't imagine being someone who is on a very fixed income or living in, an even lower community that doesn't have funds to be able to keep in touch with their loved one or to help their loved ones. What they go through going into debt and having to make a choice of, as Bianca had mentioned, the mother paying a light bill or putting money, paying the phone bill so that she can know that her son was okay. Being a mother myself, I know what that feels like, to want to have that connection with your loved ones. And it's imperative for you to be able to do that without being put into debt or without going broke to do it, or having to make hard choices between what bills you're going to pay in order to do that. So, for me, this profiteering bill will help alleviate that, and to take that burden off of not just myself, but other individuals who are affected by this. I'll also say that, unfortunately, my, son doesn't get to do video visits, but when you add in the video visits due to COVID, that price went up even more because a 20-minute visit is what, well, it was before they changed the price, $20. And then a 50-minute visit was like almost $30. And half the time the equipment didn't work. So you might be lucky to get a good 10, 15-minute visit, depending on which one you went with, because the equipment is so shoddy. And they would always blame it on, you know, if you call GTL, they would say, oh, it's the facility. And then you call the facility and they would blame it on GTL. And so it was just a blaming game. Nobody really took responsibility for not being able to have communication with your loved one. And it's sad because communicating with your loved one is critical, not just for the families, but also for those individuals who are incarcerated. It helps them to know that they are loved, they are missed, that they are wanted in their community, that they are, you know, a part of their community. And it helps in the rehabilitation process of them wanting to do well and to be better people when they get out. So this bill is very critical. And I am grateful that, you know, Sean and others are working to bring this change to Virginia, because I think it is going to be so helpful for many. So I will turn it back over to Sean.
Okay, thank you. And we will dig more into Paula's story and any of your stories that you'd like to tell and share with us. But Chuck, you did a deep dive on the numbers here in the jails, in both jails and the prisons. And we discovered a lot of different things, and Bianca touched on some of it as well, of sort of what is being said of where the money's going and why they need it and what the actual reality of that is. So can you tell us a little bit about the numbers, and then we can tell a little bit more about the bills on the back end of that, and then open up the floor a little bit at that point.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sean. So when you're talking about commissions, especially in prison telecom, prison and jail telecom, it's important to differentiate between prisons and jails. So the Virginia DOC obviously holds people for a much longer period of time, and more people pay attention to it because of that. And that doesn't mean it's good. It is abhorrent. It is terrible. They take about $4 million a year just in commissary commissions. They charge people 5 cents just to send an email out to their loved ones, which is insane to me because I can't speak for the rest of the people attending this meeting, but I cannot personally recall a time when I've ever had to pay a single cent for a single email, and I've probably sent 100,000 of them. And so 5 cents for every email is simply profiteering, pure and simple. That's just a way to plus up the DOC's budget. And unfortunately, the jails are even worse. The jails are the wild, wild west. So I know Bianca touched on $38 million in commissions collected across Virginia jails in 2020 against only $2 million spent on programming. Well, I'd like to actually run through some of those numbers for specific facilities just to give people an idea. So if you were unfortunate enough to have a loved one incarcerated in the Virginia Beach City Jail, they collected in 2020 $2.4 million in commissions. They reported $0 spent on programming from those commissions. 70% of all Virginia jails reported $0 spent on programming during that year. And to be clear, these aren't numbers that I came up with. These are numbers that we collected from the state compensation board, and those numbers come directly from the jailers themselves. And each sheriff and each sheriff's financial officer has to sign a statement saying that these numbers are accurate to the best of our knowledge. And so they admit that they are not actually spending hardly any of this funding on programming. They just want to use it for day-to-day operations of the facility. And as Bianca so aptly put it, a lot of times that just leads to expanded security that no one needs. And so it's a waste of, frankly, the money of the community that would be better spent if it just remained in the pockets of the people who actually need it. And another thing that I like to talk about is that these commissions aren't small. They're not tiny. It's not 2 or 3%. In Virginia DOC, they take about 10% for everything that you spend on commissary. That goes directly back into the facility. And that's pretty bad. That's about an 11% tax. If you are incarcerated in the Hampton City Jail, they take an 80% commission for every phone call. So you take the already inflated price that the prison telecom company is charging, and then you quintuple it because the sheriff wants to plus up their budget. So that is a 400% regressive tax on an already vulnerable population. Frankly, there's no way to justify it. They attempt to, they can't, and they say, well, we're spending it on programming. That's just a barefaced lie. And that leads us to how we intend on changing these things. So as I mentioned, in the past year, we proposed 2 bills. One of them deals specifically with the prisons. One of them deals specifically with the jails. We do that because there's an issue of oversight and authority, whereas the jails are kind of locally governed. The prisons are a state facility. Both of the bills do almost the same thing. What we're trying to do is we're trying to lower the costs of incarceration for the family members and for the people who are incarcerated. So that includes in DOC free phone calls, a fixed rate to transfer money onto people's account, because, oh, by the way, if you want to send your loved one money, they charge you for that too, and they charge you a higher percentage of that if you're sending less money. So they target the people who have the least, because they know a lot of people who are incarcerated don't come from families who have much. We also regulate the amount of profit that a private company can make if they're selling commissary goods. The idea is that sometimes they charge 4 or 5 times what the amount of the good is actually worth and what you can buy it for in the free world. And so we're trying to say, okay, we understand that you are a private company. There's not going to be a motivation to do this, and most facilities don't have the bandwidth to provide it on their own, but you can't profiteer this. So we're going to say you can make 10% additional profit on this, and that's it. You can't make a 500% profit, because that's insane, and because that doesn't serve the good of the community and the good of Virginia, and the good of, frankly, everybody on this call. We also deal with things like regulating the amount of phones that are available within a facility, because a lot of times if we make the calls cheaper, the demand is going to rise, and then we risk frankly a limited access, and we're worried about facilities letting their infrastructure fall down. And we want to say, okay, you have to have a certain amount of phones. You have to provide this to people to make sure that we have this access, because frankly, prison communication is the best form of programming that we have. It is the most effective for reducing recidivism. It's the most effective for keeping people safe and for giving them hope. And so any Department of Corrections that actually cares about the people that they're incarcerating and wants to see recidivism drop and see all of these people return to their communities needs to ensure that they have access to their families, because that support system is what gets you through. And that support system is what allows you to continue to come out and be a productive member of society and to do the great things of which you're capable. So we proposed both of those bills. And in a year when, frankly, a lot of the legislation was killed in the House, these passed as studies. And so where we're at right now is that we have 2 studies going on, sponsored by the legislature, where we're going to spend the spring, or part of the spring, all of the summer, and part of the fall, looking at this issue and trying to come up with recommendations for the legislature. And I think that's where everybody on this call comes in, because these are public hearings, and we want to make sure that we are adequately representing your interests and that we are advocating for you, because you are who we serve. So one, we would highly encourage you to, keep an eye out for emails from ACLU Virginia, because we're going to keep you updated about opportunities for you to testify and to share your stories like Paulette did. And by the way, it's really hard to follow up because that's such a compelling story. And 2, we're going to continue to keep you updated on progress and on what these bills look like, because unfortunately, on the study, it's not just advocates like us, it's also the law enforcement officers and the sheriff's associations who are going to try and pull some arguments that we find less than valid. And we really want to make sure that we have access to your insights and to your lived experience, so that when they say, oh, we're spending this money on programming, not only do we have the numbers, but we have all of your stories. And we can say, that's just not true. And here are all of the people who are willing to say that. And that really will help us come up with a solid list of recommendations to help push these bills through the legislature next year and begin to change this really, really unfair system. So Sean, did I miss any of the details? I know they're really big bills.
They are really big bills, and as Bianca mentioned, this is the first time that any state has taken like as big a swing at all of these different things, all these different ways that you sort of get hit and nickel and dimed while you're incarcerated, and how the families are obviously are the ones that are really paying that. And of course, Bianca hit on it. But it's really when we were talking to legislators about this, some of the pushback was, well, these are, these people are incarcerated, they broke the law, I don't really care if they're getting charged a little bit more. And what started to get some traction, of course, was, hey, it's not the people that are incarcerated that are paying this. It is hardworking tax-paying families that are bearing the burden of these costs. And there's actually a lot more a lot of little things that you sort of missed, Chuck, because there are so many ways that the Department of Corrections and the sheriffs get you. And for those of you that don't know me, I spent 16 years in prison in the Virginia Department of Corrections. I was pardoned by Governor Northam about 2 years ago. And so I've paid these fees. My family and loved ones have paid these fees. And I'm going to tell you about a couple more of them that happened. And I'll tell you about one of them when I got out of jail. When I got out of prison, I was handed a debit release card, and it had the money that I had in prison. It had the money on that, and for me to go and get that money, to withdraw my money that was mine, cost me about $25 in fees, just to transfer it, not in ATM fees or things like that we all pay. This was just simply to transfer it over to my existing bank account. If I was going to go through it and take it out through the ATM, it would have cost me even more. When the Department of Corrections owed me about $100 when I got out. It took them about 3 weeks, almost a month, to deposit that money onto that debit card, because that's how they do it. During that time, because the fees are so exorbitant on these debit release cards, that $100 that they owed me was already eaten up. I was already in the hole with the fees, so I didn't get any of that money that the Department of Corrections actually owed me. There's a few other ones, and Harvey, good to see you. Harvey Yoder touched on one. Harvey does a lot of wonderful work here in Virginia. Touched on one in our jails in Virginia. We have a pay to stay bill. It's been in effect for going on 20 years now. And what it does is it allows the local sheriff or the regional jail in Virginia to charge everybody that's incarcerated up to $3 a day. And to be fair, some jails do it, some jails don't. Typically, the regional jails are the ones that do charge up to $3 a day. And there is additional legislation in Virginia that not only do you have to pay that $3 a day, but if you don't have the money, if you aren't able to pay that money when you get out, the sheriffs can then send you to collections and then damage your credit, make it harder for you to access housing and all sorts of different things that you need to be able to access to be able to be successful in contributing to the community. So those were just a couple of the things that we went after when we, a couple of things, more of the things that we went after in our legislation. We did, of course, video calls. There is video calls we went after. We want to be sure that everybody is able to access video calls. We also don't want a jail or a prison to be able to say, well, since you have video calls, we're not going to provide in-person visitation anymore. That's really critical. That in-person visitation is really critical, particularly for people serving long-term sentences, but for people that are in the jails as well. We really think that people should be able to have that one-to-one human contact. And so that was something that we really wanted to address. I'm sure there's more that's in the legislation that we haven't touched on yet. We certainly see your questions in the chat. Bianca, can you tell us a little bit more about, and I'm going to get some of these questions, but Bianca, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the impact that this has? And I know Bianca has a wonderful TED Talk that I encourage you to watch. I'll drop it in a link to it in the chat. But you touched on how one of a friend of yours will talk to their son in the dark. And I remember that hitting me so hard when I first saw your TED Talk. But the 1 in 3 families going into debt, simply trying to stay in contact with an incarcerated loved one. Can you tell us a little bit more just about the broad impact that this has on families and especially on children?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, in some respects, I'd say that I bet there's people on this call, some of whom are currently on the screen and some of whom are not, that can probably speak to that better than I can, right? In the way that Paletra was also discussing it, right? I think the reality is, like, as I said earlier, right, 1 in 3 families with a loved one in prison goes into debt simply over the cost of calls and visits. That doesn't include cost of commissary. That doesn't include cost of money transfers. It doesn't include all these pay to stay, like all these other components, right? I dropped a story in the chat, but I'll just say it. I recently got outreach from a woman in Connecticut who was just, I think, really distraught. Her husband had been incarcerated for a DUI, had an alcohol addiction after he came home. The DUI, I mean, the incarceration obviously didn't serve his needs in order, to deal with his alcohol addiction and substance abuse. And he ended up committing suicide and dying by suicide. And after he passed, the state of Connecticut sent her a bill because they have a law in Connecticut that allows the state to put a lien against your estate if you pass away for incarceration, for your incarceration, to pay that back. So she got a roughly $10,000 bill when he passed against his estate, despite the fact that he has 3 children and all of this. So we think about, the way in which this impacts families can be, I mean, the stories are endless, the mountains are endless, right? But it's grandmothers. I mean, there is a grandmother by the name of Martha Wright Reed who fought till the day she died for affordable phone calls with her incarcerated grandson. She skipped medication in lieu of the cost of calls, right? She was blind and couldn't write, and so she couldn't send letters. Calls were really the only way she could speak to her grandson. She was also in a wheelchair, so visits were also difficult, right? And so those types of impacts, like I said, you talk to any person who has a loved one who's incarcerated, a mother, a grandmother, a father, a child, and you will just hear the endless hardships that are raised by these egregious costs that families are expected to bear. I think when we were talking about women, right, I think it's really important to remember that women, obviously the prison population is overwhelmingly men, but the women behind bars is the fastest growing population. And women behind bars are overwhelmingly overwhelmingly mothers, in large part of children under the age of 18, right? And so them being able to communicate with their loved ones, with their children on the outside is incredibly important, right? Similarly, though, with fathers who are incarcerated, when fathers are incarcerated, when men are incarcerated, is like usually the women who are left holding down the entire community. They are left holding down their families, their children. They are left to be the breadwinners, to support not just them and their children and their lives in the community, but now also support the prison system and their loved one inside. And so, I think the impacts, like I said, I would love to invite some of the folks who are here on screen. And of course, if you're in the participant room and you're not on screen, you're more than welcome to send a chat and ask to be moved up to the main panel and share your experience. And I think if anybody is willing, I will say, I bet that your experiences will convey a lot more than any numbers I can offer.
So, Paula, I would love to hear a little bit more from you about how often, sort of, how you're able to visit with your loved one, and of course, as Bianca said, please, if anybody would like to join, we please do invite you to if this has impacted you or your loved one, we'd certainly, or if you're sort of in the space or the advocacy space, we'd love to hear from you. Any thoughts? This is an open conversation, and we're going to be, asking for your help moving forward. So we'd love to hear from you if you have the ability to help. If you have relationships with legislators or other advocates, we'd love to hear from you as well.
So Sean, I will, also caveat and say that, my husband is literally a 3-hour drive from me. So I can't go visit him every weekend, particularly, especially now with COVID. So communication and phone calls are even more critical. There are some families who live, 5 hours, 8 hours, even longer distances away from their loved ones. And so having to spend, $1 a minute on a phone call to keep in contact with them makes it even more difficult, especially when they can't go and visit with them because of the distance of the drive. So that's another piece that goes into play with this whole, profiteering, is that phone calls are critical, and sometimes the only way that families are able to stay connected and keep in contact with their loved ones, like Bianca say, the grandmother in a wheelchair and, not being able to see, the phone calls are crucial. And so when you can't afford those phone calls, how are you supposed to keep in touch with your loved one? How are you supposed to know that they're okay? And I couldn't imagine going to bed not knowing that my son or my husband were okay. Hearing their voice gives me comfort, and it not only gives them hope to hear my voice, but it gives me hope to hear their voice. And that's another factor into it, is that, that communication of voice is crucial. So I couldn't imagine having a 3-year-old child having to go to bed and not hear their mother's voice or hear their father's voice. You never want a child to suffer in that way. And having these astronomical prices that they charge to keep in touch with the loved ones should not happen. And it should not be. It should not be the world that we live in.
Wanted to touch on a couple little points, and please, anybody that would like to speak, please feel free to chime in. I want to touch on a couple other bill points that we brought forward in this, and this is something that those of us that have been incarcerated in Virginia have experienced, and I noticed it in the chat about how oftentimes the gangs control phones, and that is not uncommon in Virginia DOC. It's not also uncommon in the jails here in Virginia. And basically what that means is in a cell block, you'll have perhaps 4 phones, and you'll have 96 men or women housed in that one housing unit. You'll have 4 phones. 3 of the phones will be run by clicks, oftentimes, and then you'll have one what we call a civilian phone. And even if that wasn't the case, even if the phones weren't run by different clicks, there's not enough time out of your, or in the time that you have out of your cell and the availability of phones, there's not enough time and not enough access to those phones for everybody to be able to call home even once a day, much less if you have, need to make a couple calls, you need to call your attorney and perhaps a loved one as well. So one of the things that we did in the bill that went for that's of course being studied now was we set up a ratio of phone to person in the housing units. So that was something that we thought was really critical to address people not being able to access the phones. We also wanted to be sure people had access to a certain period of time, a minimum period of time every day. We also went and wanted to increase, in Virginia, you have to have a call list. So you can only have so many numbers that you're allowed to call. In Virginia Department of Corrections, you can only call 15 numbers. That's all you have. And I know I looked through my phone the other day and I have a couple hundred numbers in my phone. I don't call all of them often, obviously, but I certainly use more than 15 of them on a regular basis. I might use more than 15 in a day. So we wanted to address that. So we increased that. We set a floor of numbers that they have to be allowed to have on their call list. I also wanted to touch on visitors lists. Virginia, again, also has, you have to submit a visitors list, an approved visitors list. And Virginia, you're only allowed to have 10 people on that list, which is just nothing. I have friends, and you can only change it, I believe, if once, maybe twice a year. I think twice a year, you can change it every 6 months. But it's simply, particularly on the back end of COVID, people are just starting to return to visits in Virginia, in-person visits, and lots of people want to see people they haven't seen for 2 years. So having that ceiling on number of people that you're allowed to see is really pretty onerous. So we really want to address that as well. I see a question in the chat here for Bianca, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the floor for her to address that.
Sure. Thank you so much. So I see the question here from Adam. Can you share the source of the statistic, or can you share the source of the statistics that you share? Sure, there's a number of sources, so it sort of depends on exactly which statistic you're asking about. I'm gonna make a few guesses and say that the 1 in 3 stat, 1 in 3 families, and the 87% of women carrying this burden is from a 2015 report called Who Pays by the Ella Baker Center. The statistics around 1.4 billion, the 90% owned by 3 companies, 80% by 2 companies, you can find in our textbook, and I will drop the link for our textbook in just a second, which has a lot on the prison industry and various different aspects that we've been talking about today. I would say probably the most comprehensive resource, and I will drop that now.
I'm trying to find my mute. Thank you so much. So Chuck, you did a real deep dive on numbers and on the sheriffs and lots of FOIA requests particularly to the sheriff's office. What were some of the responses that you got when we actually tried to sort of get more information about this and really do a bit of a deep dive?
Oh, well, I am very glad that you asked that question. So in Virginia, FOIA is sort of an essential tool, and I think it's probably the same across the country for advocates especially. As everybody on the call is, I'm sure, aware, prisons and jails are essentially black holes of information, and they never give it up willingly. And so if you want to understand anything about what's actually going on, you need to talk to the people who are inside, and then you need to use any legal mechanism you can to try and force some information out, essentially. Now, unless there is, frankly, no existing record, then the facilities are supposed to give you all of the information they had. But, when I was asking for information, there were oftentimes people in those facilities would just say, no, we aren't going to give you that. Or they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, we don't have a record of that contract existing, or we don't have a record of this basic financial revenue. And so they essentially will stonewall you. And unfortunately, as an independent advocate who's also not an attorney, it can be very difficult for me to force that information out. And that leads us kind of into why these studies are so valuable, because it's a way of forcing their hand with the backing of the legislature. These facilities essentially will have to share what they're doing, and they can't just stonewall us. Another common tactic that they've used to stonewall is, frankly, they just charge you a lot of money. So I had a FOIA request into the Virginia Department of Corrections a few months ago, just asking for some invoices, basic financial documents that any facility or any firm would keep on hand as a record. They attempted to charge me about $60 per invoice. And frankly, a lot of facilities do that. I think I've been charged 4 or 5 times just in this last year for basic information that shouldn't take any time or effort to compile. But that is one way that they discourage people from asking for additional information, is they say, well, we are allowed to charge you for this time. We are going to charge you $30 an hour, and it's going to take us 2 hours to compile each of these records. And so, as you can imagine, that adds up incredibly quickly. So really, again, these studies are some of the best opportunities that we as advocates have to gain a clear-eyed insight into what's actually happening into these facilities, and also to get our voices heard as a community of impacted people. I know oftentimes it is very easy for the legislature to ignore or dismiss the voices of those who are incarcerated. and their family members. And this is one of the rare occasions where they have gone out of their way to say, yes, this is an issue. We want to hear your advice and your input. And I think that's why these studies are so exciting and so valuable, because we get information, and also everybody who has a loved one incarcerated has a chance to say their piece and to tell the policymakers what's happening to them. So I am highly excited to get these studies underway, and I'm sure that we will be communicating with you as soon as we understand what that structure looks like and all of the different ways that you will be able to share your story. And we would love if you would be willing to share it, and we really are excited for it.
So I think it's a good opportunity to pause. We put a lot of information out there, and Pauletta told your story, and Bianca and Chuck have really given a real good overview of the landscape and about what prison profiteering is and how it's being executed in Virginia. But those of you that are here as panelists, I'd really want to invite you. We're interested in your thoughts, anything, what you think about the information, or if you have questions, of course, and perhaps if you've been impacted by this.
No impact, thankfully, but in this case, I'm kind of here as a student, and I want to do a capstone research project on prison profiteering. It kind of just got me this gets me much more excited about it. And I'm going to do a bunch of those public information requests. And luckily I know a lot of legislators and lawyers, so I'm pretty sure I'm going to get the data. My question is there any facility or sheriff or someone that's done it right, that kind of said, okay, this is baloney and we're going to take an entrepreneurial approach to this? And is there an example of like the right way to do it, so that we can actually figure out how to transition? Or is it just we got to blow up the system?
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that, having seen so many systems. I would say sadly, there's not a place that's done it right. I mean, it's hard to do prison right. Let me just start there, I think, as like a framework, right? It's like prisons just don't generally solve social problems, and the social problems they are somehow expected to solve, right? On a broader sort of philosophical perspective, right? People are being disappeared into prisons because of social failures that drive poverty, that drive low education, that drive limited employment opportunities, that mean people have mental health, issues, substance abuse issues, all these things, and prisons just don't solve any of those problems, right? I think what we're trying to do here with some of this legislation is really at the minimum address the way in which the system is being used to extract the limited wealth and resources of people, on top of the fact that they're already sucking, right, liberation and dignity out of people. And so we are, looking for those pieces. I would say in terms of places that have done anything right, there's certainly not like one place where you could point and you can be like, oh, this place has no exploitation. It's just not in the framework. But there are agencies where if you say, okay, well, when it comes to specifically their phone call policy, or it comes specifically to their commissary policy, maybe that's, there might be some things to learn, from other agencies for sure. Love to hear from others. I in some ways, like, some of what drives me for this work is just like, is this exciting? Does it feel like, oh, okay, we're making a difference? And I'm seeing some head nodding, and I'd love to just hear your voice. Don't be nervous. We're all friends. We're all family.
I guess my question is, what can we do to try to get these bills passed? Tell us what we can do. I know testify. Where do we go to testify? How do we know when we can testify? We need to get these bills passed. How do we do it?
Yeah. So just to like create some framework, right? Thank you so much for that question, Deborah, and for leaning in. I think as Chuck and Sean mentioned, the bills passed, but they passed with what's called a study. And the study basically means that the bill implementation has been delayed till after the next session. So basically for the next few months, we will be sitting around a table, in particular, Sean, Chuck, and myself, with sheriffs, with other sort of quote unquote stakeholders, to discuss the merits of the bill, the impact of the bills as they've been written, right? And then the idea is that the study will have to come back with any recommendations to changes to the bills as written that would be legislated in the next legislative session for implementation then in July of 2023. Now, I mean, it kind of goes without saying, we in large part drafted the bill, so we don't really want to see them change, but we're going to have to really argue that. And that's where your voices really come in. And it's to come in and say that what was legislated, what has passed is what should stay the law, and should be implemented in July of 2023. And so as was mentioned, because you signed up for today's webinar and event, we will, I think the ACLU will be reaching out, and you'll definitely get follow-up, especially in those moments when there will be opportunity to go to the Capitol and share your story and share why this is important to you and to your family with legislators, so that we can refute the ridiculous arguments made by law enforcement, and ensure that that the voices of those who live and breathe this every day are represented. And so, right now, I think it's more about, we just love to hear in these last few minutes, if there's anything that feels unclear or, didn't feel like it was tackled, that you'd like to see go further or something of that sort. And then we'll be sure in the weeks and months that follow to keep you posted on all those opportunities. And I see a hand from Brad. Should we just take it?
Hi, thanks. So I'm sure you all have noticed that there are two things going on in terms of like the public discourse about crime. One is that specifically Republicans are using this as a wedge and exploiting it for its political utility. Like the idea that there's this crime wave that is very debatable about whether it even exists. And lately, Virginia has suffered the same kind of phenomenon that has been present in San Francisco and New York, where the media also latches onto this false narrative. And those two things are really problematic when you think that in Virginia, we've got 2/3 of government is Republican, and like the media is really the only way to get through to people, like voters who are kind of ignorant about the stuff. Not the only way, but it's one of the major ways. And I'm just curious, and I talked with Sean about these issues a lot, and we this past session, we did a lot of strategizing about how to advance criminal justice reform with sympathetic conservatives. But Bianca and Chuck, I'm curious your thoughts about like, how do you beat back those false crime narratives that are going to impede the ability to make progress on this point? And how do you get people to care when they're being filled with so much misinformation? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and Chuck, pass it to you. So Brad, I mean, absolutely. I'm sure people have been seeing these narratives all over the country, and you're right. We're getting hit with them hard in New York and San Francisco as they have a recall going on and all this stuff for their DA. Look, there's no doubt that it's like way easier to, to approach news and media when you're fear mongering. Like, it's just a really simple thing to tap into is people's fears and create, an anecdote. All you need is like one, subway urination for the entire thing to like devolve real quickly. Somehow everyone has, an opinion on criminal justice in a way that you think they're all experts. And so, it's sad because outlets like the New York Times are just republishing the words of, the police. And I think it was really powerful when Trevor Noah, during, his address at the correspondence dinner, kind of actually, mentioned that. Well, it's funny how the New York Times just literally is like a talking puppet for the police. Can we do anything about that? I will say there are actually new journalistic organizations and standards being created actively as we speak. And so hopefully those will have some impact. But I think the thing that's exciting about this bill is that I think that we have a way around it. There's, as say it or not say it, we're not actually freeing people with this legislation. I wish we were, that's the work of many. But this legislation is simply to stop exploiting people, right? And that's actually something that we've been able to find bipartisan support for all over the country. In every single campaign that we've run, with the exception of one, we have had bipartisan support for the legislation to make phone calls free, to reduce commissary and do all that. Because, I think that there's a difference between, a conversation about safety and crime, and a conversation about whether we then use the carceral system to exploit people in that process. And then the second thing I'll say is just that it also leans heavily on this argument. The reason we call all of our campaigns to make phone calls free Connecting Families campaigns. That taps in deep into the conservative, kind of core of family unit. And, it leverages families and children who are really, in the end, the ones paying almost all of these costs. And so I think, there's ways to message around the sort of made up crisis that's happening while we get a hold of that narrative.
So I see one more hand up, and want to be respectful of everybody's time. We want to check in with Mr. Yoder. I saw Francis just joined the panel as well. So if Francis has a question, we want to get to her also. But Mr. Yoder, good to see you, and we'd love to hear your comment or your question.
Am I to go next? Okay. I just wondered if there was a legal argument to be made that a sheriff or someone running a regional jail should not have the authority to add to someone's sentence. In other words, to say the sentence that the judge gave you is not sufficient. You deserve to pay 500 times the cost of phone service. You must pay the daily keep fee, whatever, on top of that. It just seems like that's somehow not only morally, but just ethically and legally wrong to add to someone's sentence. And in this case, to add to the family having to do that.
Harvey, it's interesting you say that, because where those pay to stay fees particularly are being implemented is in the jails. And most of the people that are incarcerated in the jails are pre-trial, and they haven't even been convicted of anything yet. So they haven't been convicted, nor have they been sentenced, and they're being charged, they're being punished already with these fees. And that is something that we addressed in this legislation, was to abolish those pay to stay fees in the Virginia jails. So that's certainly something that we don't disagree on. As far as the legality of it, I certainly can't speak to it. I'm not an attorney. I'm not sure if that's something that Brad Haywood would like to chime on, and since he is an attorney that's on the call. And I also wanted to see, Francis, if you had a question or a comment, or if you just enjoyed joining the panel. I know you just had a video call with your loved one.
I just wanted to jump on really quick. I did miss a little bit of it, so I'll catch the replay. But I just wanted to thank you for hosting this and for having it. I just wanted to encourage everybody who's new on here to know that we are definitely stronger together. And as things move forward, to be the voice for the voiceless. And thank you so much.
If I can just add one quick thing, sorry, Sean, to Harvey, I think that your question is very interesting, one that I haven't seen explored. It may have been. I'm not sure if there's precedent. I am an attorney, but I don't actually practice in that way. So I think, but I think it's, you know, in particular the pay to stay, but it's just so commonplace that I guess in some ways I'd find it hard to believe it hasn't at this point probably been litigated and answered. And also just really quickly, Brad, I appreciate your comment in the chat about, you know, the reality that, you know, whoever's currently in charge doesn't seem to have compassion for folks inside. And I think that's where the argument about this being about families and people on the outside is really relevant, is really critical to really center the stories of families and loved ones inside, because that's a different compassion point. And the last thing I'll just say on that is that it's also really important for us to have victims in the room. And I want to say that very intentionally. There was a very resounding, ridiculous comment made in the Connecticut legislature the first time this bill to make phone calls free went through. And one of the legislators gets on her pulpit and just like one of the Republican conservatives against the bill and just starts, you know, sort of ranting about how, you know, victims who are murdered don't get a free phone call in the last 30 minutes of their lives. And that's why, you know, we should throw away all of this. And she made a comment very explicitly that, you know, the bill authors, while well-intentioned, didn't think about the victims. And, you know, one thing that we did when we came back, well, the first thing we did was I walked up to her and I said, I am that victim. My boyfriend was murdered and I wrote this bill. And the second thing we did is we got victim rights advocates in our coalition, so that couldn't be a comment that was repeated again. So, you know, part of this is about bringing everybody into this room and really realizing what we're fighting for.
So we are going to go ahead and wrap. And Paula, I'd like to give you the last word. I do want to thank everybody, Bianca, Chuck, for being here. Paula is a partner in a lot of work that we do, and I was fortunate to have lunch with her today. But all of you for attending, the people that are in the panel and the people that are just listening, thank you for attending. We appreciate you taking some time out of a busy Wednesday, I'm sure. Hopefully you'll be able to go out and enjoy some of the lovely weather. But Paula, I'd like for you to please have the last word, since this impacts you every day.
Sure. You know, I just want to say that, you know, being a family member that has loved ones that's affected by this, I know that there's a lot of arguments that, you know, lawmakers don't listen to the families, but I will say that if enough of us contact them, they'll listen. They have no choice to listen, but to listen. Our tax dollars pay them. They're paid to hear us, and we are their constituents. And I'm always on the side of, if you have a lawmaker that doesn't want to listen, when it's time to vote, go out and vote. That's another way to have your voice be heard, is if they don't want to hear what directly affects you and they don't want to do something about it to change it, then they shouldn't be sitting in that seat representing you when it comes to making decisions on legislation. So it's key to have your voice heard, whether it be phone calls, emails, and if they don't, you know, and meeting with them. But if that doesn't work, when it's time to vote, get out and vote and make that decision, and then let your voice be heard. And then it'll send a message to others that you're the reason that they're in the position that they are in.
Thank you again for joining us, everyone. Please keep an eye on your email. We will be letting you know when these hearings are happening. We want your stories. We want you to come and participate. If you have suggestions or questions, please follow up with us. Bianca put her information and Worth Rise's information in the chat. Of course, you can always reach us at the ACLU of Virginia on our Facebook, on our Twitter, on all the different social media platforms. And we thank you again for joining us. It's really been an excellent discussion, and we look forward to discussions moving forward in the future in the coming months. Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you.